The National Football League is the world's largest sports league, so it comes as no surprise that it has some of the world's greatest stadiums, including several of the world's most expensive. With that being said, here are the NFL 2021 stadiums. Soldier Field, home of the Chicago Bears. We start off with what is technically the oldest stadium in the league, but it's not really. All but the rather spectacular facade of the old stadium remains. It's also the smallest NFL stadium in terms of capacity, but nevertheless, it looks fantastic in my view. I love a mix of old and new, and you don't get much more of a sharp contrast than you do at this stadium. One downside is the lakeside location, which makes it feel extra cold. It is Lake Michigan, one of the Great Lakes, just in case you clicked on this video for the lakes. Which you almost certainly didn't, so moving on. State Farm Stadium, home of the Arizona Cardinals. You wouldn't think a stadium that was designed to resemble a snake wrapped around a barrel cactus would be so sleek and stylish. Quite beautiful. It is one of the few stadiums in the world with a field that can roll in and out of the stadium. But it's the only stadium in the world with a retractable roof as well. You might be wondering why they needed both, but that's because despite the roof being able to retract, they still wouldn't get enough sunlight in order to maintain a natural grass field. And they really wanted a real grass field, and I can respect that. It's just better to look at. One drawback of the retractable field though is that the seating behind the southern end zone understandably looks a little strange. It does after all have to move out of the way of the retractable field. So that's another thing that's retractable, the seating. But the rest of the stadium looks quite normal. Well, really nice actually. Allegiant Stadium, home of the Las Vegas Raiders. The Death Star, as it's known, had the misfortune of opening in the year 2020, but I guess it can only be uphill from that point onwards. It was an interesting choice by the Raiders to go with a completely black stadium in such a hot climate. I know that's their colours, but it's just a little surprising. It is the only other stadium in the NFL with a field that can roll in and out, but this one has an artificial turf field for UNLV games underneath. It is, however, the only stadium that has a giant sculpture in front of a giant retractable window. The sculpture, by the way, is the largest 3D printed object in the world. Overall, I'd say that they couldn't have designed a stadium that was more Las Vegas than this. Well, perhaps if it was clad with $100 bills. Ford Field, home of the Detroit Lions. The city of Detroit gets a bad rap, but their stadium game is on point to be fair, and I think their pizza looks quite good as well. Oh yeah, it does. But that's irrelevant, I'm just hungry. Ford Field cleverly incorporates an old warehouse into the design, which looks fantastic. Although I'm not usually a fan of a stadium with an opaque permanent roof, I think I'd rather a roof over my head than snow on my head, because, well, Canada's just across the river, so it must get pretty cold. The reason I don't normally like stadiums with a fixed roof is because you often can't see the sky, but at least with this one there are plenty of windows that let in a decent amount of natural light. But a translucent roof would have been better. Hard Rock Stadium, home of the Miami Dolphins. It started out its life as a fairly nondescript multi-purpose stadium that was shared with the Marlins of Major League Baseball. It's now far from being nondescript, having been renovated in 2015 and turned into a stadium that is one of a kind, with those huge spikes in each corner that support the roof canopy that extends outside the stadium, which I love the look of. Between the old and the new versions of the stadium, both of the Dolphins' colours have been used for the seats. But why not a mix of both, like a mosaic style? That would look pretty cool. I do really like the Dolphins' colour scheme. Anyway, there's not just football that takes place here, there's also an annual tennis tournament, and now an F1 Grand Prix will take place in and around the stadium. Paul Brown Stadium, home of the Cincinnati Bengals. a stadium that has won numerous awards for its design. But despite that, the fans don't really want to come and visit. It had the lowest average attendance in 2019, if you exclude the Chargers who were playing at a small soccer stadium. But I guess people don't buy tickets to a game because of the stadium's architectural qualities, do they? They do it to watch some big sweaty men run around in tight pants. And it helps if those big sweaty men are good at their jobs. But it is a beautiful stadium in my view, with its sleek exterior, as well as those roof canopies on either side, which look good as well as providing a little bit of shelter, and those partially open ends of the stadium that allow some spectators a decent view of the Cincinnati skyline on one side and the Ohio River on the other. And we're back in Florida at Raymond James Stadium, home of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. On the surface, it just looks like a fairly straightforward, typical NFL stadium. Fairly symmetrical, no roof canopies or anything like that, and relatively few seats behind each end zone. Instead of curving around each corner, the seating is at sharp angles, which looks sharp. I slightly prefer that. Although the design isn't anything out of this world, it certainly does the job. Yeah, there are no frills or anything. Wait a minute. What's that? Is that a pirate ship? Well, if that's not a frill, I don't know what a frill is. I don't really. But any stadium that has its own pirate ship is pretty great in my book. And a beach? Wow. And tiki huts? I could take or leave them, but the pirate ship, wow. That's so cool. US Bank Stadium, home of the Minnesota Vikings. Firstly, spoiler alert, there is no Viking longship behind one of the end zones, unfortunately.
Well...
Nevertheless, it is one of my absolute favourite stadiums in the world, let alone in the NFL. I said the last one was looking sharp, but this one looks like an oddly shaped shard of glass. Very sharp indeed. If you weren't able to judge the scale and had never seen this design before, you'd probably think it was a basketball arena, because, well, you just don't see football stadiums that look anything like this. It ticks pretty much all of the boxes for me. Yes, it's an indoor stadium, but it's covered with translucent panels that not only let in plenty of light, but on one side offer magnificent views of the Minneapolis skyline. And on top of all that, the seats are purple. How often do you see purple seats? Gillette Stadium, home of the New England Patriots. Unlike most NFL stadiums, it's located a fair way outside of any major city. It's about halfway between Boston and Providence. But when your team is called the New England Patriots, named after an entire region incorporating multiple states, that is much bigger than Old England, it does actually make sense to be close to the center of that region. The design is fairly typical. In fact, it was based off of M&T Bank Stadium in Baltimore, that you'll see later on. But it's by no means the same design. One thing that definitely sets it apart is the lighthouse behind the north end zone, which is a pretty cool touch. It's not quite on the level of a pirate ship in terms of nautical related novelty stadium features, but you know what they say, you can't have pirate ships without lighthouses. I think that's an old Chinese proverb. Lucas Oil Stadium, home of the Indianapolis Colts. It's yet another wonderfully unique design that you probably wouldn't see in any other country. In some ways, the stadium is very old school, with its brick, steel, and glass exterior that's inspired by the college stadiums and arenas of the great state of Indiana. It also sort of looks like an old-fashioned factory or something. But in other ways, it's very modern, such as its retractable roof and retractable windows that allow the stadium to change from a fully indoor stadium to a somewhat proper outdoor stadium. Once again, those windows offer an excellent view of the city's skyline. But yeah, there's no mistaking it for a factory on the inside. It looks fantastic. That's nothing against factories, but stadiums are just better, aren't they? But you know what they say, You can't have stadiums without factories. I think that's a Taiwanese proverb. FirstEnergy Stadium, home of the Cleveland Browns. It's very strange that you'd name your team after a cartoon character, but I guess Albuquerque named their baseball team the Isotopes, a reference to The Simpsons, so you're not alone. If I ever become a billionaire, I think I'll start an NFL franchise in Gary, Indiana, and we will be known as the Snails, like from SpongeBob. Yes, it's a small market, but I think the Snails have potential to become the new Packers. FirstEnergy Stadium is quite eye-catching. The seats are all orange, as you'd expect by the name Cleveland Browns, and from some of those seats, as with many stadiums we've seen so far, you get a pretty good view of the city skyline. This time it's the world-famous Cleveland skyline. Just like Soldier Field, it's located on the shore of one of the Great Lakes. This time, Lake Erie. Heinz Field, home of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, there's no let-up on the brightly coloured seats. And from some of those seats is an even better view of not just the city of Pittsburgh, but a bridge that matches the colour of the seats. The stadium is located right where the Allegheny River meets the Ohio River, for brunch every Friday. It's one of the few stadiums that has hosted a pro team as well as a college team since its inception. The college team being the Pittsburgh Panthers, who even have their own separate locker room. Other than that, the design is fairly standard, and would be more or less symmetrical if it weren't for that expansion of the north end zone seating. But yeah, what a great location. Levis Stadium, home of the San Francisco 49ers. But it's technically not in San Francisco, but Santa Clara instead. Although it's a perfectly fine stadium with plenty of technology packed in, it's probably one of the least spectacular billion-dollar stadiums there is. But I'm mainly speaking of the exterior, which from a distance almost looks like scaffolding. But having said that, the interior is rather spectacular, with those 4 tiers of angular seating on one side and 2 tiers plus numerous luxury suites on the other, which is topped off, literally, by a rooftop garden, a nice little touch. And they actually use the vegetables grown there at various eateries throughout the stadium. I like that. Lumen Field, home of the Seattle Seahawks. A stadium that's held in very high regard, and one of my favourite stadiums in the US. It's just got a bit of everything. I like the hits of brick on the exterior, the 2 sizable roof canopies that not only look good but provide plenty of shelter. But the stadium still has some seats that are left uncovered, which I like, because I believe the sun does sometimes show itself in Seattle. There is even some photographic evidence. See? So if it is sunny, you might want to sit in the sun. It also allows for some decent views of the Seattle skyscrapers, and some fans even get a view of Mount Rainier off in the distance. The stadium also has its fair share of uniqueness with this unusual seating situation behind the north end zone, and that vertical scoreboard. On top of all that, it's known for its incredibly loud atmosphere. The same thing can't quite be said for TIAA Bank Field, home of the Jacksonville Jaguars. It doesn't really help the atmosphere if you win just once a year, but you've got to give credit to the loyal fans that still show up. It's not easy forking out money to watch your team lose, but I'm sure that the man with the magnificent mustache appreciates it. Anyway, the stadium was built on the site of the former Gator Bowl Stadium, and it still hosts the Gator Bowl game that the original stadium was named after. But that's college football, of course, nothing to do with the NFL. It has a fairly uninspiring exterior, and on the inside, it too is fairly basic. But it does have some additions that add to the fan experience. For starters, you don't know the meaning of a wide screen before you look at TIAA Bank Field. I mean, look at the size of those video boards. There are also a few swimming pools to help you cool off in the sun. That's how you know you're in Florida. I didn't notice any swimming pools at Soldier Field. Nissan Stadium. Nissan Stadium. Americans are probably right with the pronunciation there, but what about Hyundai? Why don't you guys pronounce the Y? Anyway, back to it. It's the home of the Tennessee Titans. It's located just a short swim from the center of Nashville, and it's a rather good-looking stadium, but it looks familiar. It's very similar to Raymond Stadium, except for the colors, obviously, the fact that the corner seating is curved rather than at sharp angles, and of course the glaring omission of a certain pirate ship. But they were both mostly designed by the same firm, so there's no foul play involved. Something that does set it apart is that it's the only NFL stadium that's also the permanent home of an FCS college football team. And I guess the red floodlights are kinda cool. They don't project red lights. I was talking about the metal that they're attached to. Lincoln Financial Field, home of the Philadelphia Eagles. Firstly, those roof canopies on each of the main grandstands, although they are small, look really cool. Like something designed by whoever designs Batman's equipment. Who does do Batman's design work? Bat Laboratories Incorporated? Actually, that name would have a negative connotation with the recent goings-on in Wuhan. Anyway, that was a digression and a half. Other than the roof canopies, the design of the Link, as it's known, doesn't particularly stand out from the crowd, in terms of uniqueness. But it is one good-looking rooster. However, the placement of the video boards is quite unique, particularly behind the north end zone, where it completely separates the top tier and lower bowl. I think that looks great. SoFi Stadium, home of the Los Angeles Chargers and the Los Angeles Rams. It too had the misfortune of opening in the year 2020. As you might already know, it was the world's most expensive stadium to design and construct. And the end result certainly reflects that price tag. With a very futuristic exterior from the bird's eye view, but a very different and quite elegant design at ground level. I just love the way the roof slopes all the way down to the ground. On the inside, it's even better in my view. The seating is made up of 7 tiers of seating, which allows those in the nosebleeds to be fairly close to the field, just really high up. Plus a ton of different luxury boxes and whatnot sprinkled throughout. And if you're not satisfied with your line of sight, well, you can always look up at the Oculus, which is a 360-degree video board of monumental proportions, the biggest of its kind in the world. To say it's a world-class stadium would be an understatement. It's universe class. Well, I shouldn't actually say that because we don't really know what kind of stadiums the Andromeda Galaxy has to offer. Mercedes-Benz Stadium, home of the Atlanta Falcons. Although the last one was more expensive, I'd say that this one is slightly more grandiose. But that's largely due to the fact that SoFi was sunken a long way into the ground. So Mercedes-Benz Stadium is a lot more imposing from the outside. On top of that, the pinwheel-inspired exterior is like no other stadium in the world. And the way the retractable roof opens and shuts is also unique. Unlike most stadiums with a retractable roof, it has a circular opening, which was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, which includes the halo. That's like the Oculus of SoFi Stadium, except it's inward facing. It too is the largest of its kind. The interior is just as spectacular. Those red and black seats look stunning, and I'm repeating myself now, but big window, views of the city skyline, etc. I should also mention that the stadium's predecessor, formerly located right next door, had one of the shortest lifespans for a stadium, just 25 years. Which you could say is a bit wasteful, but if this is the result, who needs hospitals, am I right? No, I'm not. Hospitals are good. M&T Bank Stadium, home of the Baltimore Ravens. Well, what do you know, some more purple seats. But other than the seats, it's different than the US Bank Stadium in nearly every way. For starters, it has more of a traditional exterior made up of mostly brick. And it obviously doesn't look like a giant shard of glass. It looks like a football stadium, as most football stadiums do. The seating layout is made up of a double-tiered bowl with 4 individual upper decks on each side of the field. The placement of the video boards behind each end zone is similar to Lincoln Financial Field, in that it's between the lower bowl and the top tier of seating. But once again, it works well with the stadium's design and allows those sitting at ground level to not have to crane their necks to see a replay. Highmark Stadium, home of the Buffalo Bills. I wouldn't be so quick to give yourself a high mark. The stadium's design is fairly similar to a plethora of college football stadiums. The way the main seating bowl is sunken into the ground, leaving only the upper deck's exterior exposed. That wraparound second tier above the lower bowl is what sets it apart though. But of course, Highmark is just a sponsor's name. In fact, this stadium was one of the first to sell its naming rights. It wasn't the most prudent decision, but they sold it to a company called Rich Products for just $60,000 a year over 25 years. I'd imagine by the time that the contract ended in the late 90s, the naming rights would have been worth 20 times that cost. So the moral of the story is, don't sign a contract that lasts as long as the Georgia Dome did. FirstEnergy Stadium, home of the Houston Texans. Speaking of naming rights, did you know that NRG is an energy company? I mean, what are the chances that their founder, Nigel Reginald Goldcock's initials, sound like the word energy when read out? You can clearly tell that it was the early days of retractable roofs when this one was built. The roof doesn't seamlessly blend into the design like it does at some of the newer stadiums. But it looks alright. And you've got to cut it some slack, it was the first NFL stadium with a retractable roof. On the inside, it doesn't disappoint. The roof being somewhat translucent lets in plenty of light during the day. Another nice feature are the huge video boards that stretch the width of the stadium. And overall, I'd say it's a pretty good stadium, worthy of Nigel Reginald Goldcock's name. Mercedes-Benz Superdome, home of the New Orleans Saints. Actually, I think the naming rights deal may have expired, but I'm gonna stick with it for now given that a replacement hasn't been named yet. Even in 2021, this stadium is still a fairly impressive structure. And I can just imagine the buzz around town when this stadium opened back in the 70s. The exterior, although you can tell it's fairly old, well, space age would still be the right way to describe it. Well, actually, space age was the space age back then, so anyway. As for the interior, I'm not usually a big fan of when you can't see outside, and that's the case with the Superdome. There isn't any natural light let in, but that's understandable given how old it is. And to be fair, it does look pretty cool under lights anyway. I do hope this stadium sticks around a little while longer. In some ways, it's the last of its kind. Bank of America Stadium, home of the Carolina Panthers. From the bird's eye view, it just looks like another typical NFL stadium, with not that much that sets it apart. But then you take a look at the facade, which is quite impressive and fairly unique. It's largely black with a bit of blue and silver. Those are the Panthers' colors. But man, those grand entrances look incredible and somewhat intimidating. The interior is just a perfectly normal, symmetrical, double-tiered bowl. It's not as exciting as the exterior, but it gets the job done, I guess. And from some seats, you do get quite a pretty view of Charlotte. That's not the name of one of the cheerleaders, but the city in which the stadium's located. Empower Field at Mile High, home of the Denver Broncos. It's the highest of all the NFL stadiums, but that's okay. Weed is legal in Colorado if I'm not mistaken. It's not my thing, but I won't judge. But no, as the name suggests, Denver is a mile above sea level, which is actually only second to Estadio Azteca if you want to count the international NFL venues. The high altitude, meaning thinner air, allows for a significant home field advantage for the Broncos, Some say it's unfair, but what are they gonna do? Excavate a mile into the earth and build a stadium? Sounds good to me. But for now, I think the Broncos fans are happy sticking with their mile-high stadium. It does look fantastic, with its triple-decker wraparound bowl, as well as a slightly open section behind the south end zone. GEHA Field at Arrowhead Stadium, home of the Kansas City Chiefs. This one is quite interesting. For starters, the unique shape of the upper seating bowl. How the corners come to a point. Kinda like the pointy thing that's attached to the end of an arrow, whatever they're called. But also, the fact that the stadium is nearly 50 years old, yet the exterior, after renovations, looks very modern. But it just works so well together that you can hardly tell it's a stadium from the 70s. It looks great. The stadium currently holds the record for the loudest crowd noise, which was recorded at 142.2 decibels against the Patriots in 2014. Surprisingly, that was a Monday night game, so there presumably would have been less drunk people in the crowd, which goes against all logic. AT&T Stadium, home of the Dallas Cowboys. It's located in the city of Arlington, which, on a per capita basis, does have a good argument to be the stadium capital of the world. But that is just because of one complex made up of two world-class stadiums and one decent one. As you can see, 7 years after Houston Stadium was built, the retractable roofs had become a little less conspicuous. In fact, it's looking rather sleek, but the significantly bigger budget might have had something to do with it. And all that glass on the lower portion of the exterior looks fantastic. But I think the interior is where this stadium really shines. 12 or so years on, and it still has an argument for being the world's flashiest stadium. Just like SoFi, I can't even count how many tiers of seating there is. And I've mentioned the video boards of several stadiums so far, but although it's not a fancy Halo or Oculus, this one certainly is impressive. It's freaking huge. It's like half the size of the field from the spectator's perspective. It could easily double as a movie theater without any issues. Well, perhaps the sound would be a little echoey, but I'm rambling because I love this stadium. It's a beauty. As is Lambeau Field, but in a completely different way. It's home of the Green Bay Packers. Out of all the NFL stadiums, this one definitely looks the most like a traditional college stadium. I mean, they still use bench seating and the exterior wouldn't look out of place in college football. I do mean that in a good way though. It has the same old-fashioned charm, but you can also tell that a lot of money went into it. And it makes sense that it's the most college-like because it's the oldest NFL stadium in reality. And most college stadiums are even older. You could also argue that it's the most iconic NFL stadium as well. You would most likely win that argument. I can't see which other stadium would be more iconic. The stadium's layout is rather simple. It's just one big bowl for the most part, as well as those additional sections behind the south end zone. And of course there is a plethora of luxury suites that wrap around the stadium. It's an elegant design that stood the test of time. Just bring an extra jacket or two. The Frozen Tundra nickname rings true. That was a freaking poem. FedEx Field, home of the football team that represents the city of Washington, D.C. I've got to say, this is the worst one so far. It just lacks something. You know what I mean? The design is just a little two-dimensional for me. Haha, joking aside, although the team represents Washington, the stadium is actually in Maryland. I think I know what's gone wrong. Clearly they got FedEx to deliver the stadium and it's ended up in the wrong place. FedEx, don't sue me. If you do, people will know it's true. But in truth, the stadium isn't one of my favorites. The exterior is okay. There's plenty of glass used, I like that. And the interior is, well, it's not monochromatic, at least it has that going for it. There is a chaotic assortment of colours. It's alright, but I can see why they are considering building a new stadium. And finally, MetLife Stadium, home of the New York Jets and the New York Giants. but unfortunately not the home of the New York Mets. The synergy would have been perfect. A lot of people from outside of the US would be surprised to hear that at one time it was the most expensive stadium ever built in America at around $2 billion in today's money, considering that it doesn't have any sort of roof. But that is by choice. An open roof canopy would have added a relatively small cost to a stadium of this price tag, maybe $50 million. But a lot of football fans would rather have the skies above them, rain, hail or shine. So why spend the $50 million on something that a lot of fans don't even want? It's the way it was back in the day, so I suppose there's an element of nostalgia to outdoor football as well. The stadium is still quite impressive though, with a very sheer and shiny aluminum facade, with some stonework at ground level, and a perfectly symmetrical triple-tiered seating layout for the most part. The seats are appropriately done up in a very neutral colour scheme, given that 2 teams play here. Plus they've got a sizable video board in each corner. An excellent stadium to end with. And that's it for today's video. If you made it this far, well, I'm impressed and grateful. That was comfortably the longest video on this channel. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, have a good one.